A stone chip flew up from behind Sampson's head as a bullet ricocheted off the chamber wall. Someone was shooting at Sampson. Charlie turned quickly in the direction of the shot, staring into the darkness and wondering bewilderedly who had fired it. Who else could be down here in the caverns? It couldn't be Chatsworth. Charlie had touched his dead body with his own hands. What about Max? Surely he couldn't have survived the onslaught of the deadly snakes and come back to life. The last voice in the world that Charlie would have expected to hear shouted out suddenly from the darkness. "Charlie, are you all right?" Charlie's jaw dropped. "Father?" He saw a hand wave suddenly from behind an outcropping of rock in the mural room. "Yes, Father, we're okay, we're over here." Sampson regained his startled wits. "Waterman, what the hell are you doing here? I'm not going to let you spoil my plans." He remembered the revolver in his hand and fired 2 shots in Alex's direction. "I'll shoot you all if you try to follow me." Alex Waterman made a disgusted sound. "Give it up, Sampson. I didn't come alone. The authorities know all about your plan." "What do you mean?" Sampson asked, edging closer to the chamber and the wall of levers. "Maspero came up with me from Cairo, and he has the police with him," Alex replied calmly. "If you kill anyone here, you'll be hunted down and sent to jail." The remains of Sampson's brittle composure were evaporating rapidly. He paused for a moment, weighing up the situation, then he announced angrily, "None of you will get out of here alive to tell anyone anything. If I close off this chamber from the other side, you'll be trapped in here forever. There's no way back the way that we came." By now he had reached the small chamber, and he suddenly dived for the entrance and the lever Rosie had chosen. "See you in hell!" he snarled, and with one last snigger he pushed himself into the narrow space and pulled the stone lever. Then he screamed as the floor tipped up unexpectedly, sending him sliding downwards. With one last look of rage, Sampson slipped and scraped on the smooth stone floor of the chamber, unable to gain a footing. He fell, screaming, all the way down into a bottomless pit, his cries eventually growing fainter and fainter. Rosie spared a short glance in his direction, then opened the amduat and read calmly, "If the heart was found to be heavier than the feather, it was fed to Ammit, the devourer, and the soul was cast into darkness. Good riddance." Charlie stared at her, and then at the blackness where Sampson had disappeared. For some obscure reason, he felt sad. Rosie squeezed his hand. "That bastard murdered your grandfather." Charlie nodded. "I know. He deserved all that he got." They were interrupted by Charlie's father as he came across to embrace them. "Are you both all right?" he asked, still reassuring himself that his son was in one piece. "Yes, father," Charlie replied, suddenly overwhelmed. After all that had happened between them, his father had come all this way and saved him from a horrible death. "But, father, how did you... how..." Alex took pity on his stammering son. "I had to come and help you, son. I know you trusted Sampson, but I've never trusted him. I didn't believe he was helping you out of the kindness of his own heart." Charlie flushed. After Sampson's betrayal, he had wondered repeatedly how he could have been so naive. His father pretended not to notice. "I went up to Wilton Hall after you left, to have it out with Sampson, to find out just what he hoped to accomplish. He wasn't there. Mrs. Andrews told me he'd left after you sailed for Egypt. So I went to Southampton and found that fancy motor car of his parked up at the dockside. The storage fellow told me Sampson had hired him to store it for several weeks." Charlie scuffed some loose pebbles around with his boot. "I'm sorry, father. I had no idea what he really wanted until he showed up in the underground tunnel, and he'd made Max swear not to tell." Rosie had been listening in fascination. "So how did you follow us here, Mr. Waterman?" she asked. Alex grinned. "Once I was in Egypt, it was no trouble to meet up with Gaston Maspero and Flinders Petrie. They made arrangements for a small boat and kit for me. I followed your twine into the tunnels. I made it through the whirlpool. I was a long-distance swimmer once, you know." "What about the snakes?" Charlie ventured, surreptitiously examining his father for signs of snakebite. Snakes? As in plural? Alex asked. The only snake I saw was an enormous dead one, and I saw an immense crocodile carcass as well. Would you have had anything to do with that, Charlie Waterman? Charlie beamed. I'm afraid so, sir, although I did have some help. Impressed, his father continued. I've been watching you all carefully, waiting to make my move, which was just now. How did you get into the final chamber, though? The entrance door had closed firmly behind us, Charlie asked. It opened easily from the other side, Charlie. It was only designed to stop people going back that way. Charlie looked abashed. Thanks, Father. And I'm sorry. I thought that you didn't care about me. Shocked, Alex remonstrated. That's not true, Charlie. It never was true. Your grandfather was a great man, Charlie, but he was something that I could never be. I lived in his shadow all my life. I rejected everything that he did, and I went my own way. I needed some love as well, you know. But I never got it. Your grandfather was always doing something more important, with his trips and his birds and other flora and fauna. Making money was my way of being successful, but your grandfather was never interested in what I had achieved. And when you were little, I could see that you were just like him. I kind of rejected you as well, especially after your mother left us. He put a hand on his son's arm and pulled him closer. I'm sorry, Charlie, for all that wasted time. I knew that I had to come and help you, to put things right. Charlie looked into his father's gray-blue eyes and saw the love and pride in them. Suddenly, he couldn't think of any good reason for their differences, and he smiled back. Thanks, Father. I'm sorry, too. And we'll help each other to put things right, I promise. Rosie's interest in Alex's story had been waning as their conversation went on, and now she weighed in. Charlie, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but the platform in the heart chamber has reset itself, and we still need to find a way through. Charlie stared at the stone levers in the small chamber, debating. Sampson pulled the one that you chose, right, Rosie? Yes, she said. According to the Amduat, that's the correct one. She gazed at the levers in her turn, then said slowly, Maybe it's you, Charlie. Me? Yes, Rosie repeated. You're the main traveler after all. It was your quest to begin with. Maybe it has to be you who picks. Charlie looked at the levers more carefully, this time noticing the hieroglyphs on each one. One had a scarab, one had a strange design he couldn't quite decipher. The third, the one which Rosie had picked, showed a heron, and Charlie knew instinctively that it was the correct one. I'll go with Rosie's first choice, he stated firmly. His father looked at him incredulously. Are you sure, son? Sampson fell to his death when he chose that lever. I know, Father, Charlie replied calmly, but Rosie thinks that's the correct one, based on her knowledge of Egyptology, and I just have a feeling about it, maybe because of the heron. Alex started to object, but then Charlie's words sank in. A heron, eh? Now why should that surprise me? All right, Charlie, if you think that's the one, I'll trust you on it. Charlie nodded. I'll go first, though. Despite his conviction, he moved onto the chamber platform cautiously. Closing his eyes for a moment, he thought, I'm trusting you, grandfather. And he quickly pulled the lever. With a slight creaking noise, the platform stayed perfectly still and a door opened into another room. Soundlessly, Charlie let out the breath he didn't realize he had been holding, and he stepped through the door. The platform reset, and the door closed behind him. Outside in the small chamber, Rosie followed Charlie's example, with the same results. Alex looked quizzically at the chamber as it resettled once more. I'm not sure I can say I've led a sufficiently blameless life, he shouted out loudly, hoping the others would hear him through the closed doorway. Don't be silly, Father, Charlie replied, slightly muffled but clearly audible. Alex pulled the lever, and was rewarded with the opening of the door and the sight of his tall son standing beyond it. He stepped off the platform thoughtfully. Rosie felt her hand cramp suddenly, and she looked down to see that her finger was resting on a particular passage in the Amduat. Her voice shaking slightly, she read it aloud. "The gate of the Duat is now open. May you soar like a falcon, may you fly aloft like a heron. Live, be alive, be young beside your father. Follow your dreams." They all stared at each other as her words echoed softly through the chamber. Charlie bent and pulled another lamp from his pack, hoping it had dried sufficiently to light up. After a few anxious moments, it caught, producing a welcome yellow flame. He passed it to his father. Then he stood, holding his own lamp above his head to shed as much light as possible. They were standing at the entrance to an enormous chamber. The flickering light of his lamp showed a myriad of images on the walls, not only hieroglyphs but paintings at least 8 to 10 feet high. A blue-green river wound its way along one wall, boats with extended sails bobbing atop the water under a robin's egg blue sky. Along the riverbanks, liberally studded with rushes painted so realistically that they seemed to rustle in a faint breeze, caravans of pack-laden camels paced majestically. Farther from the riverbanks, working towards the other walls, were rich golden fields of grain, farmers plowing or reaping or simply enjoying a moment's respite. On another wall, an enormous stepped pyramid rose grandly toward the deep blue sky, a painted sphinx warily keeping watch at its entrance. The colors shone with a brilliance that should have been impossible given the age of the painting. "The field of rushes," Rosie breathed as the three of them gazed at the spectacle laid out before them. This was the afterlife for the ancient Egyptians, their final destination after their journey through the underworld. "If they pass the test, you mean," Charlie remarked. She nodded and pointed at a portion of the wall where tombs had been cut into the rock. Above each tomb was a set of hieroglyphics. "And here are the tombs of the pharaohs, Charlie: Zoser, Sekemket, Kaba, Sneferu, Khufu, Jedefre, Khafre, Menkaure, Shepseskaf, Kentkawes, all of them. This is the tomb of destiny." Alex moved nearer and lifted his lamp to illuminate one of the tombs. "Shouldn't there be something in here then?" he inquired. Rosie and Charlie exchanged a confused look. Then they moved to light each tomb in turn. They were all empty. There were no mummies, not even a tomb offering could be seen. Rosie sat down heavily on a stone bench, her forehead puckered in distress. "I don't understand, Charlie." Alex continued to prowl around, examining as much as he could see. "It looks to me like these were never intended to be used, son. There's no evidence that these door openings were ever sealed." Charlie sat down next to Rosie and slid his arm around her. Rosie had been muttering to herself, shoulders hunched as she thought. Now she sat upright. "I'll bet it was Imhotep all along. This was all his doing." "Imhotep? But he's the one who built the sanctuary, Rosie." "Yes, but think about it, Charlie. Let's say he promised the pharaohs a secret sanctuary where they could all enjoy eternal peace after they die. But instead of keeping his promise, he and his priests spirit their bodies away, bury them somewhere else, who knows where, and he then steals all their treasure. And the best part of it is that everyone thinks the mummies and the treasure have been hidden away in a secure place for all time." Charlie looked doubtful. "It's the perfect deception. Steal something that no one knows has been stolen. The man was a bloody genius." She made a strange noise that sounded vaguely like a dry chuckle, or possibly a hiccough. "You're right," Charlie said slowly as the reality of the situation began to unfold. "No treasure, just empty tombs. Instead of protecting them, Imhotep himself was the ultimate tomb robber. Rather ironic, actually." Rosie turned to face him, and he immediately realized that the odd noises she had been making could not be construed as laughter. Her face had reddened, and her eyes were blazing. "The bastard stole all the treasure, Charlie! All of it!" Charlie took her shoulders to try to soothe her. "Calm down, Rosie. We'll think of something. All is not lost." She was not to be mollified. "Calm down. I've traveled all this way, gone through so much, and lost my father as well. For what, I ask you? For nothing, nothing at all. I was hoping to get something out of this, Charlie, and now I've got absolutely nothing." She flung off his hands and jumped up from the bench to stand irresolutely, hands balled into fists. Charlie rose, also still convinced he could quiet her. "Rosie!" She turned a furious look on him. "You just don't get it, do you, Charlie? Just get away, leave me be." With a final imprecation concerning Imhotep's immediate parentage, she stalked off towards a corner of the hall, where she paced back and forth, arms wrapped around herself. The sound of her angry voice drifted back towards the two men, where they stood gazing after her. Wearily, Charlie slumped back down on the bench. After a moment's contemplation, Alex joined him. "Are you disappointed, son?" he asked. "You've come all this way and found nothing, it seems." Charlie shook his head. "The treasure doesn't mean anything to me, Father. I came here for an adventure, but it's all gone terribly wrong." He began an intense study of the fingernails on one hand. "People have died because of my silly ambitions. I don't think I realized before that life can be that tough. I was caught up in my own selfish little overprivileged world. I've seen all kinds of emotion on this trip, good and bad. Greed, envy, jealousy, hatred, self-pity, love, dedication, selflessness. I didn't understand what the world was really like, and I didn't realize how well off I was." The other hand came under scrutiny. "I'm just glad that the three of us are still alive." Alex sighed. "Let me give you some advice, Charlie, and you can do with it what you will. To be truly happy, you need to learn that there's no real reason to life. We're all born, we live, and we die. That's it. Basically, life is hard work and full of sadness. If you can come to terms with that, then you can try to be content. And that's about the happiest that you will ever be. It doesn't matter who you are or how much money you have. We all get old, and when your time is up, you have to go." Charlie glanced up at the empty tombs around them. "I suppose the pharaohs are the ultimate proof of that, aren't they? It didn't matter how wealthy or powerful they were, in the end, they died anyway." "Yes, and some people die young, of course, or we fight wars and kill ourselves for little or no reason. Some people die unexpectedly, or you might live a lifetime like your grandfather. We torture ourselves with worry about things that mostly don't matter, instead of remembering the things that do matter, like your close family. I know it's a cliché, but it's true. If you realize that, then you can be truly happy." Alex's fingernails suddenly needed inspection as he continued. "Ambition can be a good thing, but it can also be a curse. You can end up neglecting your family and friends. If we strive for things that we can never achieve, we end up living with regret instead of happiness. It's all about being content with what you have now and just being happy with your lot, today." Fingernail examination complete, he looked straight into his son's eyes. "The problem is, son, it took me almost 50 years to figure that lot out." Charlie nodded. "I know what you mean, Father." He looked down at the ground for a moment. Then he met his father's gaze. "I didn't find any treasure on this adventure. But I found my father. That's more important to me. And I've also realized what matters to me most, and she's waiting for me back in England." A broader smile than Charlie had seen in a long time spread across his father's face. It looked like he was about to say something important, but Charlie spoke first. "I love you so much, Father," he said, with tears in his eyes. "I love you too, son," Alex replied, as the Waterman men hugged each other longer than they had ever done before. Neither one spoke for a few minutes, and when Alex began to speak again, his voice was suspiciously raspy. He gave his son a sheepish grin and cleared his throat. Then he tried again. "There's something you might want to know, Charlie, about the hall." Charlie blinked curiously. "What about it, Father?" "Well, you remember I told you that I wrote a contract to provide for the preservation and maintenance of the nature preserve?" "Yes, you said Sampson agreed to it." Alex nodded. "That's right, but I should point out that at the time of the sale, Sampson had no family. Although I personally didn't care much for the hall, I was concerned about what might happen if Sampson died without an heir." "So, what will happen now that Sampson is dead?" Charlie asked, a wild thought starting to burrow its way into his conscious mind. "Well, the contract I drew up includes a special covenant, in the event of Sampson's death, that reverts ownership back to our family upon payment to the estate of the original purchase price. And since Sampson is now pushing the daisies, and I've got a son who's about to be married, and who will undoubtedly be willing to take an interest in keeping the place up and running." Charlie flung his arms around his father once again. "Oh, Father, I don't believe it. You mean the hall comes back into the family? You inserted a covenant? Oh, thank you so much. I promise I'll do us all proud." "Being a lawyer has certain advantages," beamed Alex proudly. Rosie's taut voice cut into the happy moment like a surgical scalpel. "If you two are quite finished, I think I should point out that I haven't been able to find an obvious exit, and we can't go back the way we came." Charlie stood up and dusted off his trousers. "Well," he said jauntily, refusing to allow his good mood to seep away just yet, "we'll just have to be creative. There has to be a way out after all. How did Imhotep get out of here?" Rosie looked mulish. "Who cares, thieving bastard?" They spread out and began pacing through the chamber, examining the walls carefully with their lamps, and then finally ending up at the opposite end from where they had entered. A stone block approximately 6 feet wide, 3 feet high, and 3 feet deep squatted a few feet away from the wall. "This appears to be an altar of some sort," Rosie commented as they neared it. "But I'm not sure—" She broke off, startled, as a small circle of light appeared on the surface of the stone. "Charlie, look!" He had already seen it. "Hold your lamp away from the altar, Rosie," he suggested as she followed suit. There was a momentary glimmer of darkness as their eyes adjusted, and then they all saw the beam of light which culminated at the altar. They followed it upwards with their eyes to see an opening high up in the opposite wall. Charlie pulled out his compass and grinned. "That's east, and this must be the morning sunrise." He put the compass away and started walking towards the east wall. "Come on, I'm willing to bet there's a way out up there." It was a large wall mural depicting the Pyramid of Zoser. Rosie contemplated the painting for a few minutes, then walked up to it and tentatively stretched out a finger to touch the vibrant colors, holding her breath, afraid too much contact with the outside world would cause the paint to crumble to dust as she did so. Amazingly, it remained intact. Her confidence increasing, she slowly worked her way along the pyramid itself, while the Watermans watched her silently. "Ouch!" she exclaimed suddenly, rubbing her hand. Charlie was by her side instantly. "What's the matter, Rosie?" "That's funny," she said absently. "I scraped my hand, but it doesn't look like there's any change in the surface here." All three heads bent closer to the painting. Alex saw it first. "Here, there's a tiny irregularity." He pressed lightly in the spot and jumped back hastily as a stone block emerged suddenly from the wall. Charlie walked over to one of the painted steps and examined the wall face. Sure enough, there was an identical odd spot on it. He pressed the area as his father had and was rewarded with another protruding block. He exchanged a triumphant look with the others, and then they got down to work. After about half an hour, they had discovered a substantial number of steps, and Charlie began climbing, revealing more blocks as he went. Finally, he reached the opening, which was large enough for him to push his head and shoulders through. The immediate view from the opening, straight out across the desert, showed only the expanse of sand and mountains curving away from where he stood. Charlie looked down, only to realize that past the small ledge where he leaned was a precipitous cliff face, sloping down at an angle of about 70 degrees, with a substantial and likely deadly drop. Carefully, he pulled his small telescope out of his backpack and returned his attention to the ground below. His efforts were rewarded when a familiar bearded profile came into view. Flinders Petrie stood near the bottom of the cliff, supervising a team of students. Charlie dug out his pendant, checking the position of the sun. It wasn't in the best location for his purposes, but it would do. Carefully, he positioned the pendant's mirror to catch and reflect the sun. Then he began to signal with it. Nothing specific, really, but enough purposeful movement to catch Petrie's attention. Sure enough, the professor noticed the erratic reflecting and directed his gaze upward. Charlie leaned out as far as he could and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Professor, up here!" The archaeologist's ears were equally sharp. "Charlie, is that you?" "Yes, sir!" Charlie screamed. "Could you get some rope up to us? This is our only way out." "Right!" the professor yelled back. "Sit tight, we'll get to you." Charlie pulled his head back in and called to Rosie and his father. "Patry and his team are down below. We're going to get out of here." He stayed where he was, helping the rescue team work their way along to him. Once they had reached the cliff opening, and a series of ropes had been lashed into place, Charlie, followed by Rosie and then Alex, all emerged into daylight and descended carefully to the plain below. Petrie trotted across to greet them. "Charlie, my boy, congratulations. You did it." "Professor, how did you know where to find us?" Charlie asked. "Oh, I've had the students monitoring a few likely areas," Petrie replied. "We studied the topology from our charts, but I just had a feeling that this was the most probable place, so we've been waiting here and doing a bit of digging. It looks like a settlement may have extended up to this point. We've found some workers' huts that were obviously shaped and deliberately placed. I intend to work it further." He glanced around curiously. "Should I inquire about Mr. Chatsworth and Max?" Charlie shook his head sadly. "They didn't make it," he said slowly, feeling the loss hit home even more in the bright light of day. He looked around for Rosie, but she had already walked away from him. The obvious tension in her posture made it clear that she didn't want his company at the moment. Petrie noticed Charlie's distress and diplomatically changed the subject. "We've got some tea and breakfast set up over here, or we can head back to camp, and you can get a bit of a wash if you'd rather." "Tea would be fantastic, thanks, Professor," Charlie agreed enthusiastically. As they started off, Alex fell into step next to his son. "Well, Charlie, it looks like you solved the secret of the notebook, eh?" Charlie shook his head. "I'm not so sure." His father gave him a sharp look. "How so?" "Rosie's suggestion is the most logical explanation for what we found, but I've got a funny feeling about this." Charlie turned to gaze back up at the cliff face. Imhotep went to all that trouble to build a secret sanctuary and secure it behind such an intricate series of puzzles just so he could steal the pharaoh's treasure. There's something about that. I keep thinking there's something more that I'm missing. "In that case," Alex remarked, "breakfast will definitely be required. Then you and I shall go through your grandfather's notebook together to see if anything pops out at us." Petrie came over as Charlie and Alex were settling down to do some serious damage to their food. "I'm off to drive Miss Chatsworth to Abydos and put her on the train. Please make yourselves comfortable. Let my students know if you need anything." Charlie started to stand at the news that Rosie was leaving, but then sank back down into his chair. "I suppose that's for the best," he said slowly. Alex's eyebrows rose. "The young lady isn't saying goodbye." Charlie shrugged. "She's had a lot of upset and disappointment on this trip. She lost her father and any hope of treasure." He squirmed under his father's intent but oddly gentle gaze. "I think I may have rather led her on too. I was carried away by all the excitement until I realized a few things. Alex sipped his tea for a moment, ruminating. She seems a very remarkable young woman, Charlie. She's intelligent, forthright, and articulate. If it will make you feel any better, I can always make inquiries when we return to England and set up some kind of fund to give her some security, now that Mr. Chatsworth has passed on. Charlie gave his father a startled look. You know, Father, you're just one surprise after another. Charlie dug the journal out of his satchel. Now, if we can only solve the question of why Imhotep did what he did. They pored over the notebook for quite some time, punctuating their work with additional cups of tea. Alex was fascinated by the intricate drawings of the hieroglyphs, supplemented by Rosie's neat penciled notes translating the text. Even Charlie's grandfather's notes interested him now, and he chuckled at some of the old man's descriptions. But neither man found anything that seemed to jump out at them with any additional clues. Alex raised his arms over his head and stretched slowly. Charlie had risen some minutes earlier and now was pacing, trying to leech some of his restless energy as he thought. They both looked up as they heard the sound of Petrie's truck rattling back into the camp. Almost before it stopped, the luxuriant mustache of Gaston Maspero emerged from the side window. "Ah, Monsieur Waterman! I see you have reunited with your son!" Charlie hurried over to the truck to shake the director of antiquities' hand. "Monsieur Maspero, it is a pleasure to see you again, although I'm afraid we didn't find any artifacts for your museum." Maspero stepped out of the truck and shrugged that particularly insouciant gesture that only the French can make, slamming the cab door behind him. "Do not be so sure, my young friend. Flinders has told me of the chambers that you discovered. They in themselves will be a great find, and of course you have your own little treasure to admire." Puzzled, Charlie started to ask what he meant, but he was distracted by the remaining passenger, who was extricating herself from the truck on the other side. "Victoria!" he exclaimed in surprise, and strode across to help her. "I don't believe it! What are you doing here?" Standing on solid ground, Victoria flung her arms around Charlie and gave him an enthusiastic kiss. "I came with your father, Charlie," she said as they came up for air. Charlie looked incredulously over at Alex, who gave him a crooked grin and a shrug, not unlike Maspero's. "Couldn't stop her, son," she insisted. He elaborated, his grin widening. Victoria put up a hand and gently returned Charlie's attention to her face. "I've missed you, Charlie," she said softly. "Did you miss me?" He felt the locket's solid reassurance against his chest. "Yes, of course I did," Charlie replied, leaning down to kiss her again. She returned it warmly, then she put a finger on his mouth when he would have sought more. "Professor Petrie mentioned that you've got yourself a new girlfriend." Charlie shook his head embarrassingly. "No, Victoria, no worries. I was a fool, but only for a short time. You're the only woman for me, the woman I want to share my life with." He grew very serious. "I promise I will never, ever leave you again." She smiled at him. "So our engagement is still on, Charlie Waterman?" she asked wickedly. "Yes," he laughed, relieved. "And as soon as we return to England, I intend to see that we are married as quickly as possible." He fidgeted in his rucksack and pulled out a small box. It contained her engagement ring. Charlie had recovered it from the garden path on the night of the party. "I'd be grateful if you would wear this for me, my darling." This time, she didn't stop him when his mouth came down over hers, and she melted into him as his arms tightened around her for a timeless moment. The small group of adventurers had settled down by the campfire for a discussion of the discoveries that Charlie had made in the sanctuary, when the unexpected sound of galloping hooves broke the tranquility of the moment. They all looked up as a single rider careened into the camp, brandishing a rifle. Charlie blinked as the horse came to a standstill in a plume of dust, and the rider's face came clearly into focus. "Brady?" He breathed in disbelief. "How did you—" Brady sneered down from the saddle, manhandling his rifle into a position that he could shoot from. "Don't move!" He slanted a look at the cliff face and the ropes dangling down from the opening high above the plain. "I see you found the tomb of destiny then, boy." The constant jibe was irritating, but Charlie maintained his calm and merely shook his head. "It was a wasted trip, Brady. The sanctuary is empty. The treasure is all gone, stolen by robbers or even by Imhotep himself." Brady peered down at him, the rifle poised threateningly. "Don't be ridiculous, Waterman. Do you seriously expect me to believe such a lie?" He ran one hand through already disheveled hair, his agitation growing. "I don't believe it. Not for a second, and you're going to show me the way in there, right now." Charlie stood up, empty hands out to his sides, as he said peaceably, "Look, Brady, I'm telling you the truth." Mouth working, Brady stared at him for a long, disturbing moment. "I don't think so. I think some extra leverage is needed to persuade you to tell the truth." Brady abruptly kicked his heels into the horse's sides, sending it swerving in Victoria's direction. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed her roughly by one arm and yanked her up to his saddle, the business end of the rifle disconcertingly close to her head. "I won't be fobbed off, Waterman. Show me the way in or I'll shoot her." Victoria struggled, trying to loosen the professor's grasp, but he held her too tightly. Frustrated, she lowered her head and sank her teeth into his hand. He yelled in pain and swung the other one, connecting with her cheekbone. The blow dazed her, and she stopped squirming as she tried to gather her wits. The red of Brady's fingers stood out clearly on her cheek, in horrible contrast to the fairness of her complexion. Charlie's slow burn made an immediate transition to absolute fury. He bent quickly and grabbed the Webley from his satchel. Before Brady could act, Charlie was running towards him, the gun raised threateningly. Victoria's slumped position on the saddle had shoved the rifle away from her head, and Brady realized that by the time he could move it back and shoot, Charlie would be upon him. In a panic, he shoved the girl off of the saddle, abandoning her, and started to turn the horse to gallop away. His ignorance of Charlie's physical fitness proved his undoing. Charlie was moving quickly enough to be able to grab at the reins. Before the astonished Brady could react, Charlie had pulled Brady off the horse and flung himself upon the other man. As the startled horse staggered away from the camp, the two men struggled on the ground. Since they were both clutching weapons, this consisted largely of one-handed punches and attempted headbutting, along with simply trying to outmuscle each other. Stockier and heavier, Brady had a slight advantage, but Charlie's anger was burning hot enough to keep him respectably in the game. Charlie heaved Brady over to land with a solid thud on the desert sand, where he lay still for a moment, collecting his breath and wits before starting to pull himself upright. Brady launched next, landing equally heavily, but he managed to yank himself to his feet more quickly. Both men stood, weaving slightly, staring at each other. Then Charlie leaped at Brady, and the wrestling began again, this time on solid ground, the guns momentarily forgotten. On this level, Charlie's strength and dexterity allowed him to more than hold his own against the heavier man, although each of Brady's punches that connected made him feel like he was being pounded by a small battering ram. He had landed some solid blows to Brady's midsection, and the Irishman was starting to favor one side, but Charlie could feel some discomfort in his ribs, which made him wonder if one or two had been cracked in his fall. Both men were bleeding from several facial cuts, and Charlie had just managed to keep his ear from falling victim to Brady's teeth, though not without the skin grazing enough to bleed considerably as well. It seemed as if Brady was starting to slow, and Charlie began to batter at him more heavily, hoping to gain an advantage. They had somehow come upright and were clutching at each other like exhausted prize fighters. Brady winced away from Charlie's fist, and Charlie moved closer, one hand almost supporting the older man while the other slammed into him. Then Brady raised his head and looked directly at Charlie. "Say goodnight, boy," he snarled, and without any other warning, rammed his head directly into Charlie's face. The ground connected with another thud. Charlie wondered dazedly why it disliked him so much. The red haze in his eyes that his fury had caused had been replaced by something more substantial as the forehead cut caused by Brady's headbutt began to bleed copiously. He pushed a hand up to wipe his eyes and realized that the gloom over them was not so much from the wound as from Brady's shadow as he stood over Charlie. The rifle was cocked and pointing down at Charlie's body. The blood on Brady's face failed to obscure his vile grin. "What do you have to say now, boy?" Brady licked a drop of blood from his mouth, and his grin widened. "Now I'll just take care of you, and then that treasure's mine." Charlie's dazed mind had a sudden vision of himself as part of a bizarre sundial, with Brady as the gnomon, casting his shadow from the sun behind him over Charlie's body. But there was an odd reflection on Brady's chest, a small circle of light. What the hell? He suddenly realized his mirror pendant had shaken itself loose from inside his shirt, and the circle on Brady's chest was from the reflection of the sun on its surface. "You know, Brady, if you shoot us all, you'll have no one to help you with the treasure. If you promise to let us live, maybe we can work something out." Brady looked at him scornfully. "I don't think so, boy. Your sort can't be trusted not to try to get in the way, do something noble, and muck up everything." Inch. Fingers moving slowly on chest. "Don't let Brady realize what I'm up to." Charlie couldn't believe his thoughts weren't audible to everyone within several miles. They pounded so loudly in his head. Little more. 1 more inch. Brady shifted his stance as he readied the gun. Hatred blazed in his eyes, and it was clear that Charlie's death was the next immediate thing on his agenda. 1 more inch, and Charlie's fingers brushed the pendant. With a yell, he grabbed it and held it up, shifting it enough to aim the sun's reflection right into Brady's eyes, temporarily blinding him. Brady let out a shout of his own and reached to clear his vision, the rifle firing harmlessly a couple of feet away from Charlie's body. Charlie threw himself to the other side, scrabbling for his Webley. Almost instinctively, as if he knew there was no time, he didn't even try to rise, but quickly aimed the trusty revolver as he rolled over and fired. Brady froze, staring at Charlie, a look of horror on his own 2 eyes, now joined by a third straight between them. Blood and brains burst out of the back of his head. To Charlie and the others, the moment seemed to pervert time, so that the slow arc of matter took months to reach the ground. Then time snapped back to its normal course. More blood spurted like a hosepipe out of the dead man, his legs collapsed, and he fell flat on his face, arms outstretched. There was one massive quiver, and then Brady's body stilled. Charlie sat up, shaking, trying to take in what had just happened, and still having difficulties focusing his eyes due to the beating he had just taken. Victoria ran over to him and flung herself down to take him in her arms, heedless of the blood and dirt. The others followed, and Alex squatted down to put a strong hand on his son's shoulder. "You had no choice, son," he said reassuringly. "Brady would certainly have killed you given the chance." "I know. He would have killed us all," answered Charlie. I could see it in his eyes. Maspero leaned over him, quickly checking Charlie's injuries. "I don't believe there is anything of grave import," he remarked, "although you will certainly be very uncomfortable for a few days, my young friend." He stood up and motioned to some of Petrie's students to come and help. "In the meantime, do not worry, Charlie. I saw everything that happened, and I will inform the authorities accordingly." A glass of whiskey helped to calm Charlie's taut nerves, even through the ordeal of the ministrations of Victoria and his father as they cleaned his various cuts and scrapes. They had also bound up his right wrist and made a makeshift sling when Charlie discovered that the reason his arm had felt so heavy earlier was because his wrist had been badly sprained. Despite his objections, Alex had also rummaged through Petrie's substantial medical kit and found surgical tape to wind around Charlie's bruised ribs until he could see a doctor in Abydos. The temporary mending completed, Charlie captured Victoria's hand in his good one. "How about a walk, Victoria?" She gave him a doubtful look. "Are you sure you feel up to it, Charlie?" "Yes, absolutely." He smiled at her reassuringly. "Come on." They wandered away from the camp towards the cliff face, and Victoria voiced the question that had been turning over and over in her mind. "Charlie, what you said before Brady arrived, about getting married right away. Are you sure?" He stopped and took her in his arms, sling and damaged wrist be damned. "Yes, sweetheart, I am," he replied, and covered her soft lips with his own for a long, thirsty kiss. Victoria curled her arms around his neck happily and kissed him back, finally coming up for air. "You know, Charlie," she said wickedly, "when we're married, I don't mind if you go off on an odd adventure now and then." Charlie laughed, pain and discomfort momentarily forgotten. "That's all right, darling. I think I've rather had enough adventures for now." He bent his head down towards hers again. "And I can think of much more enjoyable pleasures to indulge. I was thinking about perhaps starting a family." He pinched her bottom. "Charlie Waterman, we're not even married yet," exclaimed Victoria with a cheeky glint in her eye. They continued to stroll along, stopping periodically to kiss, and finally sat down below the cliff entrance, hands still entwined. Victoria leaned back against Charlie's shoulder with a sigh of contentment, and they sat talking quietly, although still spending more time kissing than conversing, until Victoria changed the subject. "I've been doing a bit of thinking, Charlie." He was still in a pleasant fog. "About the wedding?" "No, Charlie. About this Imhotep fellow." "What about him?" Charlie asked, indulgently, amusing himself by playing with a few golden tresses with his good hand. She gently disengaged her hair, though with a smile that said she really didn't mind. "I read all about him on the boat from England. He was a very clever fellow, you know." Victoria sat up a little and turned to face him. "You said that he devised all these tunnels and things to fool the grave robbers, so that the pharaohs could rest for all time, and the people would think they were buried in the pyramids. A kind of deception, yes?" Charlie nodded, and she went on. "Well, what if the tomb of destiny was a kind of deception itself, Charlie? You know? When you finally got through the tunnels, you thought that the tombs were empty, like the empty pyramids, I mean." "So what are you getting at, Victoria?" he asked, his curiosity whetted. She shrugged. "Well, if you were an ancient tomb robber and you found the sanctuary empty, you'd go home, wouldn't you? And tell your tomb robber friends not to bother either." Charlie stared at her, his mind reeling. He thought about what she had just said for a moment or two, putting the pieces of the puzzle together in his mind. "Victoria, you are brilliant." He gave her a triumphant smack on the lips and rose to his feet excitedly. "Of course. How could I have been so stupid? The empty tombs may have been a decoy as well." She rose also, smiling, and he kissed her again. It was all a ruse to fool any would-be robbers, make them think the tombs had already been robbed and the treasure stolen. Talk about the ultimate deception. After 4,000 years, Imhotep is still fooling us. Victoria's eyes were shining. "Could the king still be in the sanctuary, Charlie?" He nodded. "I think that they could be. After all, they wouldn't have cared about money. Their goal was everlasting peace in the afterlife. They would have been willing to fund Imhotep's deception to ensure it. That's got to be the true secret of the sanctuary." He slid the sling off his arm and started off towards the ropes hanging down the cliff face, grabbing one of the pickaxes which had been left there as he went. "I have to go back up there." Alarmed, Victoria put out a hand. "Charlie, you can't. Your wrist." Charlie turned and grinned at her happily. "I'll be careful, I promise. But I have to find out for certain." He turned back again and tied one of the ropes around his waist, then took another and began making his way up the slope cautiously. Maybe it was his excitement, but for some reason the way up seemed to take less time than the way down, even with one hand slightly out of commission. In any event, In no time at all, he was standing in the chamber, examining the wall at the rear of the altar. Sure enough, there were a series of symbols painted on the wall, the color of the paint only slightly darker than the brick, and thus easily missed. There was the sun symbol and the earth, and here, he saw, was a triangle, the symbol for heaven. "This has to be it," Charlie breathed to himself, and began tapping the wall around it. Sure enough, that brick and the others surrounding it gave off a somewhat hollower sound than the farther bricks. He blew lightly on the bricks to remove any sand grit and dust, and slowly the faint outline of a door appeared. "Right then," he muttered to himself. He raised the pickaxe and was about to swing it when he heard Maspero's distinctive voice behind him. "And what have you found?" "I'm not sure," Charlie replied, pickaxe still poised. "But if my hunch is correct, behind this wall lie the tombs of the pharaohs, the very thing that we have all been searching for." Maspero mused quietly. "Are you sure that is really what you have been searching for, Charlie?" Now the pickaxe began to descend, and Charlie turned to stare at the Frenchman. "What do you mean, sir?" Maspero leaned back against the altar and took out his cigarette case, first offering it to Charlie, then busying himself with it when the young man shook his head. The cigarette arranged and lit to his satisfaction, Maspero sucked on it for a long moment before answering. "Petrie and I are old hands at this archaeology lark, Charlie," he said. With a grin, he added, "His specialty is pots, you know." Charlie nodded doubtfully and waited for the other man to continue. "We've spent our lives digging up artifacts, beautiful objects from a civilization that in many ways was much more advanced than our own." He waved the cigarette-free hand expansively. "We have thousands of wonderful artifacts at the museum. It's full to the brim and people come every day to see them. But really, they give them only a passing glance. The bored little children want to be somewhere else, and their parents are ignorant of the greatness of the civilization that they see on display." Charlie thought about the exhibits in the British Museum. "But isn't that the way it often is, Professor?" Maspero shrugged dismissively. "I suppose so, but it's become a bit like a circus sideshow, Charlie. The mummies are the star attraction, removed from their final resting places to be entombed in glass cases for everyone to see." He leaned forward, his eyes now intense. "We are nothing but tomb robbers ourselves, Charlie. What do you think of that? Do you not agree?" Another lengthy drag on the cigarette, and Maspero shook his head reflectively. "I often think perhaps the artifacts would be better off under the sand. It's almost a curse for them to be found, their eternal sleep disturbed by tomb robbers." He gave Charlie another sharp look. "What do you think about that, my young friend?" Charlie said nothing, but the pickaxe had drooped almost to the floor. Maspero raised one eyebrow and continued to talk. "I also spend much of my time stopping greedy people from exporting these artifacts." There was a pause while Maspero began fussing with a new cigarette. Charlie was still silent, thinking. Maspero inhaled, blew out a smoke ring, and went on. "The wonderful objects, which no doubt lie behind that door, would cause a feeding frenzy in the antiquities market." He put the cigarette to his lips again, taking several drags on it before speaking again. Finally, he stubbed it out on the floor and straightened up from the altar, his posture more purposeful. "If you open that tomb, Charlie, you will be famous, without a doubt. But you will also disturb a 4,000-year-old secret sanctuary. You will disturb the sleep of the pharaohs. And you will introduce chaos into what is ordered." Charlie laid the pickaxe down carefully and leaned back against the altar, taking the old notebook out of his pocket. Slowly, he began to flick through the pages, revisiting each part. The meeting between Nicholas Kratzer and Henry VIII 400 years earlier, Herodotus's journeys over 2,000 years ago, and Imhotep's design another 2,000 years before that. And his own adventure, and what he had learned along the way, the people who had shared in it, and the people in his own life, his father, his grandfather, and Victoria. As he pondered, the sun continued to stream in through the roof opening as it had done for 4,000 years, and Charlie realized that, while some things would obviously matter to him in his own life, in the greater scheme of things, most of them would have little or no importance. Strangely, the thought didn't bother him. After all, he concluded, his ability to find contentment in his own life, no matter where that might lie, was what was important. He didn't have to change the world, he just had to understand how to treasure his place in it, and in the order of things. Maspero looked at him keenly. "You have reached a decision, Charlie?" "More like an epiphany," Charlie admitted. He looked up at the sunlight streaming in through the wall opening and spoke. "It's a new day today, another day of peace and order in the universe." He smiled and pulled himself to his feet, accepting Maspero's helping hand. "I don't think the pharaohs should be disturbed today, do you, sir?" Maspero smiled back and shook Charlie's hand. "Well done, my friend. You remind me even more of your esteemed grandfather. He was a great man, very wise and very sincere." Charlie glanced around, still amazed at the beauty of the paintings on the chamber walls. "So what are you going to do here, sir?" Maspero waved a hand. "It's quite simple. I'll close the tomb up when we leave, and any records will be conveniently and permanently misplaced. No one else will ever know about this place." He held out a hand for Charlie's notebook. Then he placed it on the stone altar. "If Kratzer's notebook remains here, it will be very difficult for anyone ever to find the way in again. Flinders will assist in hiding any evidence here and at Abydos, and I will have the stela removed from Saqqara." "Removed?" Charlie asked. "Yes, I have a storeroom at the museum for which nobody has a key, if you know what I mean," Maspero replied with a twinkle. Charlie was nodding. "It sounds like you've thought of everything." "I have also a plan for Miss Chatsworth," Maspero said smugly. "For one thing, she doesn't know the real purpose of the sanctuary. She thinks it was a hoax. And for another, I've offered her a job at the museum. She cares very much about the ancient artifacts and their preservation, and I'm sure she'll keep quiet about your adventure. I've promised her a very generous salary, part of which your father has offered to subsidize." Charlie nodded again. "I suppose you've taken care of that fairly well, then." He walked back over to the door and traced the faint outline with one finger, trying to visualize the next chamber. Behind the wall lay Imhotep's tomb, where the brilliant architect slept beneath a beautiful gold mask for all eternity, a faint smile carved on the mask's lips. Beyond him, in a sequence of chambers clustered around a central corridor, lay the undisturbed tombs of the pharaohs of the 3rd and 4th dynasties, surrounded by treasure beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Charlie took a step back and pulled his grandfather's penknife out of his pocket. Carefully, so as not to damage any of the hieroglyphics, he carved an inscription into the soft plaster as Maspero watched in approval. "Pray for the soul of Moses Chatsworth, Edward Sampson, and Max, whose wearied bones lie close to this place." Alex's voice broke the peaceful silence. He had arrived in the sanctuary, bearing a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. After making quick work of the cork, he pocketed the corkscrew and began to pour. "Gentlemen, let us celebrate. A toast to what is important in life, happiness and contentment."